Good evening, everybody. Today we have a special short panel discussion with three renowned therapists, including myself, on the controversial topic of sexual attraction in therapy. My name is Alan Roy Anthony, and sitting here on this virtual panel with me is Nurul Husna Izzati and Ashuvani Nair. Today we are discussing the question of how should therapists approach sexual attraction in therapy and what are the legal implications of sexual attraction in therapy. Sexual attractions in therapy has been a controversial topic since Sigmund Freud first treated the subject under the lens of psychoanalysis in the early 1900s. Freud's writings warn of the dangerous effects of eroticized transference and countertransference on the therapeutic relationship. These warnings, coupled with infamous extreme cases of sexual relationships in therapy, for example, Carl Jung's infamous sexual relationship with his patient, Sabina Spilrin, led to the notion that good therapists do not at all experience sexual attractions in therapy. Now, what do you think of that, Ashubani?
Thanks, Ellen, for the opportunity to speak on this panel. You can call me Ashu, by the way. On that note, I think that the work of a mental health practitioner or any helping professional that deals with mental health and well being is inherently intimate. Therapists foster a relationship with the client, and although this relationship is largely professional, clients experience emotions you would normally have in intimate encounters. Example, feeling approved, heard, and getting an unconditional positive reaction. Accordingly, sexual attractions are not a rarity in therapeutic relationships. S- a study from Son and Jochai reported that in a review of the literature since the early 1980s, that over 70% of therapists have had at least one client disclose their sexual attraction to them. Moreover, a variable but sizable number of therapists have also experienced attraction toward their patients at least once in their careers. This is true for both male and female therapists. Another study by Pope said that making it a non-exclusive experiences among therapists. These statistics should not surprise you. Sexual attractions are a normal part of the human experience and should be expressed more often as such for mental health practitioners as well. However, as we will see later in the discussion, there are some variances in this regard, with some believing sexual attraction to be unquestionably unethical and others accepting a gray area. Furthermore, there are variances in how therapists respond to sexual attractions in therapy. Therein lies the crux of the ethical questions of sexual attractions in therapy.
I see. Thanks, Ashu. But before we move any further, I would like to ask a question to Husna, perhaps. Let's define sexual attractions. So, what are sexual attractions in therapy?
Thanks, Helen. Sexual attraction in therapy has usually been portrayed as having sexual feelings towards clients or therapists. However, it could be depicted better through erotic transference and erotic countertransference, which entails also feelings of love, connection, and affection. Erotic transference is defined as the projection of unconscious feelings from previous experiences or relationships of clients onto the therapist. These feelings tend to be a product of the carryover effect of the client's past and are displayed to the therapist in the form of attitudes, emotions, and behaviors. Therapist's personality and behavior do play a role in the client's transference, thus the client's attraction or sexual feelings towards the therapist is an indication or transference as well. Erotic countertransference refers to therapist's internal or external reactions to the client based on his past vulnerabilities or unaddressed conflicts. Although it is the behavior or way of conduct of the client that causes the trigger for countertransference, it is mainly due to the therapist's own past insecurities or unresolved conflict that causes such emotions or feelings to occur, said by his. Similarly to transference from clients, therapists that are experiencing sexual attraction towards clients indicate countertransference.
Thanks, Husna. Now let us move on to the main body of the discussion. I like to put it on the floor, but perhaps answer it myself first. How do therapists usually respond to sexual attractions in therapy? Now, the dilemma of sexual attractions in therapy usually begins with patient disclosure of sexual attraction towards the therapist. Patients are usually unable to disclose such feelings. However, when they do, therapists tend to feel uncomfortable and react in certain ways that predictably impact the therapeutic relationship, whether positively or negatively. Introspecting after being exposed to sexual attraction by a patient, or in some cases, their own sexual attraction toward the patient, most therapists find themselves in an apprehensive mood. Prince in 2016 found that many therapists feel either stressed out or in shock. One participant describing it as feeling anxious, uneasy, or perplexed with the attraction she received from the client. Now, these feelings of apprehension regrettably results in a decreased capacity to think and avoidance in dealing with sexual interaction.
This sort of reaction to sexual attraction in therapy is not entirely unjustified. There are cases where patients may disclose such attractions only to exploit the therapist's inexperience in the matter. For instance, in one case study, a young blind boy asked a therapist if he could touch her hand to understand what she looked like. The therapist felt nervous and uncertain because she didn't want to say he could touch her, but her counter transference was mainly guilt, and so she allowed him. The boy sat very close with her and rubbed his fingers on her wrist back and forth multiple times. She told him to stop and later realized he took advantage of her, knowing that she's a novice therapist.
I see. That's so terrible. Thanks for the insight, Ashu. I think this sets the stage nicely for my next question, actually, which is whether sexual attractions in therapy are a black and white matter, or is there really a gray area?
Well, the possible risk of inadvertently crossing the boundary makes it reasonable for therapists to feel apprehensive when confronted with sexual attractions in therapy. As such, there are therapists who believe that sexual attractions in therapy are unquestionable unethical. That is, under no circumstances can sexual attractions in therapy be justified. These also often derive their stances from their religious, cultural, or theoretical affiliations, among other factors. This stance is consistent with the early warning of Freud as well, who warned of countertransference clouding the judgment of the therapist and therefore bringing harm to both the therapeutic relationship and to the patient.
True. On the flip side, however, to outright refuse acknowledging sexual attractions in therapy may also bring harm to the therapeutic relationship and the client. A client who is shut down after genuinely expressing their sexual attraction to their therapist, admittedly a very vulnerable disposition, may lose hope in the therapeutic relationship, inhibiting all possible progress from that point upward. Some even leave therapy because of such an abrupt response. Not only is the client affected, but also the therapist. A therapist who does not address their own sexual attractions in therapy render themselves unable to explore their emotions and perceptions, leaving them vulnerable. All therapeutic decisions have an impact on the client's well being at all times. It is the responsibility of the therapist to provide a response that will protect everyone involved. It is no different here. Acknowledging a great idea for sexual attractions in therapy allows the exploration of the emotions and perception of both client and therapist that may only lend power to the therapeutic relationship.
Thanks so much for the insight, guys. I totally agree. And to add on that, actually, while some therapists shun the idea of entertaining sexual attractions in therapy at all, others actually find relief in it, thinking that it is a cue for progress. In this way, entertaining sexual attractions in therapy can actually become an ethical response, even an encouraged response in therapy. Prince in 2016, again, for instance, describes a therapist who encountered who, when encountered with a sexual attraction from a client, felt relieved as he was able to get insight or cues into the client's mind. To him, attraction is not an unusual situation in therapy, as it explains the oddness and peculiarity that is happening in the therapy room. One might feel shocked at first, but later it may turn out to be quite useful information to advance therapy for the client.
Yeah, that's right, but don't go too far. This does not mean that therapist's sexual attractions should be disclosed to the clients. Self disclosure when confronted with sexual attraction in therapy is a common move among therapists. According to Hayes in 2014, at least 75% of counselors have disclosed their feelings to the client. To be fair, it's not entirely unreasonable. These counselors claim honesty to be a valuable virtue in their trade and is included in the intimate process of therapy. And yet, it may not be the best time to cultivate such a virtue. Self disclosure in therapy has been shown to be one of the initial steps toward the eventual boundary violation by being sexually involved.
You make a very, very good point there, Ashu. But if not through self disclosure, how then does a therapist ensure that they derive value from sexual attractions in therapy?
I think I'll answer that one. Well, the consensus in the field seems to be that a therapist who encounters sexual attractions in therapy should bring their concerns to a supervisor or a colleague instead of merely introspecting and figuring things out for oneself. Therapists are more likely to arrive at an ethical and therapeutic reformulation if they discuss these concerns with their colleagues. Fortunately, a decent percentage of therapists are comfortable with speaking to their supervisors on the subject. Prince 2016 reports that 67% of therapists feel at ease to share their experiences with a supervisor or colleague. In the words of a participant in Prince's study, it is quite helpful to have a supervisor that is not shy or ashamed to discuss such a topic. However, it is very discouraging when the supervisor finds the topic to be a taboo or unethical. Therapists become more vulnerable to handling the situation in the wrong manner when they fear it.
I see. But what of the other 33% of therapists who find it uncomfortable to share these concerns with their supervisors? That's still 3 out of every 10 therapists, finding difficulty seeking help to navigate these sort of issues.
Yeah, it turns out one of the main difficulties therapists may face when deciding to bring their concerns to supervisors is feeling unsafe, internally and externally. Young, inexperienced therapists largely feel internally unsafe. They're only beginning their careers and not as self assured as their more experienced colleagues are, leaving them more vulnerable as well. Some others also feel externally unsafe, that is, they fear the judgment of the supervisor or their colleagues should they discuss these concerns with them. This is especially true should there be some theoretical or cultural differences between the therapist and their supervisor. Roger in 2011 stated that this is quite a taboo discussion among therapists and their supervisors.
I see. Well, then, given the importance of supervision in the process of navigating sexual attractions in therapy, we cannot turn a blind eye to these small yet significant groups of therapists who are uncomfortable bringing their concerns to supervisors and colleagues. I think in order to pave the way for more discourse and transparency, we must address both, like what you said, the internal and external safety of young, inexperienced therapists. Now, training young therapists to be less speculative and perhaps to explore topics of concern with their supervisors more freely is one way to facilitate a sense of internal safety. As for external safety, supervisors should be trained to at least bracket their negative perceptions of concerning topics such as these and to foster a positive relationships with their supervisees. So I think training plays a big part in facilitating ethical responses from therapists when confronted with sexual attractions in therapy. All right, we now move on to speak a little about the legality, yeah, of sexual attractions in therapy. I begin. I think the legality of gross sexual boundary violations in therapy ultimately depend on the state or country in which the violation was committed. In the US, mental health practitioners crossing the boundary may be sued by affected clients under malpractice, and in some states be charged by the state as a felony being an offense in our language. The problem of legality becomes much less clear when you consider the nuances involved in sexual attractions in therapy and the geographical location of the ethical violation.
Yeah, I take your last point. Sexual harassment in therapy has recently become a hot topic in Malaysia and around the globe. The charge of sexual harassment is heavy and may have legal implications for both the therapist and the patient who engage in such behavior. Discussion about sexual harassment in therapy was prompted most recently by the advent of the Me Too movement, highlighting the unrecognized prevalence of sexual harassment in various domains of life, including therapy. This movement is of no doubt important, especially given that most sexual boundary violations go unreported. However, as we have established, therapists run a business that is inherently intimate without clear boundaries at the minute level. The possible misclaims of sexual harassment becomes a real problem. Son and Georgi in 2014 reports that there are therapists who consider sexual attractions or minor sexual engagement, example flirtation, teasing, sexual remarks, gesture, to be considered sexual harassment. The discussion of the nuances of sexual attractions in therapy is therefore an important discussion to have. And it's especially true since the legality of such relationships often sync with the ethical standards set.
Well, in Malaysia, the discussion revolves around the prominent case of Gurdeep Singh, relatively recent, surfacing only recently in 2019. Dr. Gurdeep Singh, a psychiatrist, was found sending inappropriate texts and pictures to one of his female clients who ratted him out on social media and took it to the courts. In a turn of events, however, Dr. Gurdeep was found not guilty of the lawsuit, only to find himself in another similar incident a few months later. The case of Gurdeep Singh suggests that holding practitioners who cross boundaries accountable can be quite a difficult task. It turns out that this is true especially for countries like Malaysia, where there isn't an official governing body to oversee such incidents.
I wholeheartedly agree. The successful enforcement of sexual boundaries in therapy depends entirely on the existence of a governing or licensing body to which therapists are held accountable. However, Malaysia has yet to have such a governing body for, say, clinical psychologists and therapists, only for counselors. This controversial problem has been brought up repeatedly by Dr. Alvin in the past. This has been mitigated by Dr. Alvin himself, who has set up the Malaysian Society of Clinical Psychology. However, there is still much to be done moving forward to ensure that practitioners who cross boundaries can be held accountable. Well, with that said, I think we have come to the end of our panel discussion. We have spoken much about the differences in responses therapists may have in response to sexual attractions in therapy, and also how to facilitate more ethical and therapeutic responses. We also covered at least a little about the legal implications of sexual attractions in therapy. So, with that, thank you all so much for joining, and I hope the viewers had a good time as well. Cheers. Good night.